The US has long been suspected of trying to sway elections in other countries, but it's something different, something more brazen going on these days.
Brazil's president has accused the United States of trying to meddle in its upcoming vote. It's an allegation the United States has denied. But what's actually going on, and how does it fit into the long legacy of American electoral interventions? From the BBC, I'm Tristan Redmond in London.
And I'm Asma Khalid in Washington, D.C. And welcome to The Global Story on YouTube.
We're going to talk about the big picture of possible US interventions and elections around the world with Asma and special guest Nahal Toosi from Politico. But really, the reason we're talking about this right now is because of a story coming out of Latin America. To find out more, I called up Leandro Prazeres, BBC Brazil correspondent in Brasilia. It all starts with two US government officials with a plan to travel to Brazil.
Well, this story is just the latest development of a series of episodes of back and forth between Brazil and the US. But this particular story broke in the end of July when the Washington Post published a story about the plans of the US government to send a diplomatic mission to Brazil ahead of the Brazilian elections that will take place in October this year. So these two diplomats, they are part of a branch of the Department of State, which has been seen by specialists as kind of like dominated or populated by the MAGA movement. So in the end of July, the US government tried to send this mission to Brazil. But then when the Brazilian government discovered that this mission was being assembled, the Brazilian government denied their visas to come to the country. They would have meetings with some religious leaders here in Brazil and also some politicians. But the Brazilian government believed that at that time that they would be coming to Brazil to foster, to fuel suspicions against the Brazilian elections and the Brazilian electoral system.
But why is the Trump administration interested in Brazilian politics anyway? What's at stake?
So the next election, the general elections here in Brazil, they will take place in October. And the main candidates are the incumbent, Mr. Lula da Silva, who is a traditional left-wing leader, leading the most recent polls. And just after him, we have the Brazilian Senator Flávio Bolsonaro, who is the son of former President Jair Bolsonaro. He's second in the polls, and he's being very competitive. Brazil remains a very polarized country. We have now the left led by Lula da Silva again, and we have the right led by Flávio Bolsonaro. So basically, that's what is at stake in the Brazilian elections.
Okay, so Flávio Bolsonaro is the principal opponent for Lula da Silva, the current president in this election. Jair Bolsonaro, as you mentioned, was his father, and he was a close ally of Donald Trump. Does his son Flávio have similar politics to his father?
Oh, definitely. But Flávio Bolsonaro has been trying to appeal to the center, saying that he's a more moderate. He said, for example, that he was the vaccinated Bolsonaro, in a contrast with his father, who is an anti-vaccine figure in the country.
I was not expecting you to tell us that his political epithet was the vaccinated Bolsonaro. So it's a politically sensitive moment. You've got these elections coming up in a few months. The United States wants to send these two diplomats to Brazil. So how has the US government actually responded to the allegations that they are attempting to interfere in the Brazilian election?
Officially, they said that these allegations were completely false. A few days ago, they issued a statement saying that that the U.S. government respects the Brazilian people and that they will work with whichever government the Brazilian people would choose in fair and free elections.
Well, are Brazilian elections considered to be free and fair by independent observers, generally speaking?
Oh yes, definitely, definitely, and not just the most recent ones, but historically, the Brazilian elections, at least in the last 30 years, I would say that the Brazilian elections, they have been seen as fair and free. Brazil has an electronic electoral system, so the votes are casted electronically. We have seen some international organizations and international observers coming to Brazil and stating that the Brazilian elections took place orderly and that the Brazilian electoral system works and is safe. But of course, we have some criticism coming from right-wing politicians and right-wing figures saying that the Brazilian electoral system is not auditable and that something should be done in order to prevent fraud. But there hasn't been any serious allegations of fraud against the Brazilian electoral system recently.
Okay, well, Leandro, to be clear, the United States government has said that any allegation that it was intending to interfere in the Brazilian elections are baseless. But that said, we have seen recent examples of Donald Trump openly endorsing political candidates in foreign elections. Would an open endorsement by Donald Trump of a particular candidate in Brazil sway things as far as the election is concerned?
So it's difficult to measure how an endorsement of Donald Trump would play in the Brazilian elections. What Lula's aides have been telling me is that they believe that an endorsement from Trump to Flávio Bolsonaro would be a good thing for Lula, because they believe that Trump is not seen as a popular figure in Brazil. The tariffs, which in Brazil we called tarifaço, have been very negatively seen by the majority of the population in the country. So the Lula camp is trying to play the card of sovereignty and some nationalism. And the Trump administration is also, at least for part of the Brazilian population, is seen as in a very negative way.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Leandro, for shedding some light on all of this for us. Fascinating to talk to you from Brasilia. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Asma, I asked Leandro if all of this was changing the way Brazilians viewed Americans, and he thought that it was a little bit too early to say, but he also said that all of this is happening at a moment where Brazil is in this kind of tug of war between the United States and China. And all of that made me think of the Donroe Doctrine, which we did some shows about at the end of last year. The Donroe Doctrine being the US attempt to reassert dominance over its perceived sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. Remember all that?
Yes, indeed. And Tristan, I think that is what's so interesting is this story is not isolated only to Brazil. We have seen President Trump offer his overt endorsements to other leaders. I'm thinking of, in particular, Latin America, as you alluded to with the Donroe Doctrine. And Tristan, you had mentioned earlier in this episode Nahal Toosi.
I'm Politico's senior foreign affairs correspondent and columnist based in Washington.
She is someone I think of as one of the sharpest journalists in town when it comes to foreign policy, just incredibly well-sourced. And she's been writing recently specifically about U.S. efforts to sway foreign elections.
The fascinating thing about this is, recently President Trump gave this speech decrying what he said was foreign interference in American elections, right? Blaming the Chinese. But in the meantime, since he's taken office, especially in the second administration, he and his team have been very clear about their preferences of who people should vote for in other countries. That has included a number of things. First of all, we all remember when Vice President J.D. Vance went to Hungary a few days before the election for the prime minister there, and he was campaigning essentially on behalf of Viktor Orban. Mm-hmm. And it didn't work. Orban lost.
Indeed.
But it was just like something you just hadn't really seen hardly at all, this type of overt thing. President Trump has flat out given out endorsements via Truth Social, whatever, to, for instance, the right-wing candidate who won in Colombia.
Oh, yes, who was just sworn in just the other day. Okay.
Correct. Another case was he told the people of Argentina that the U.S. Basically would or would not help the country with $20 billion in financial assistance if, depending on how they voted for the party of Argentine President Javier Milei.
I do recall this. We in fact did an episode on this because it was essentially economic bailout in exchange for a preferred candidate's party.
Right. And Trump preferred Milei, and Milei's party won. And what we're seeing now, though, is this backlash in other countries to this U.S. interference. We saw what Brazil has done recently, denying visas to American diplomats because they were worried about the electoral interference. Mexico recently passed a constitutional amendment to try to ward off foreign election interference. That kind of went under the radar.
Tell us more about that.
So basically, it was the ruling party in Mexico, Morena, which is the party of President Claudia Sheinbaum, pushed through this amendment that included a number of things about protecting the election system, but it did include this kind of vague idea of we need to do more to protect from foreign interference. And the former president of the country, also a party who's a member of this ruling party, came out and actually issued a statement that very directly accused the U.S. of trying to interfere. And that was a real signal of what the Mexicans were worried about. We've also seen Europeans speak out about things like J.D. Vance's trip to Hungary and some grants that the State Department has recently been issuing. They're basically aiming these grants at parties or organizations that European leaders worry is about boosting far-right political parties in Europe. I think the State Department grant actually says, it's not about partisanship and it's not about political parties. These grants use terms like, we want to boost organizations that focus on things like migration and our common Western civilizational heritage. Okay. And that last term in particular is very much a signal that we're talking about far-right political parties that want to restrict immigration. So European leaders say, look, you guys are trying to interfere in our elections. Stay out of it.
Why is the Trump administration doing this? And have you gotten any clearer understanding of what their intentions are?
I can tell you what White House spokesperson Anna Kelly said to me. She said, President Trump is a great American statesman who will speak or work with anyone, and he makes no secret about those he likes or supports because he is the most honest and transparent president in history. Candidates who align with the president's way of thinking are winning elections around the world because everyone wants to replicate America's success in their own countries. Suggesting that this is in any way comparable to China's illicit acquisition of 220 million U.S. voter files, the largest compromise of election data in history, is asinine.
And to be clear, China's foreign ministry has strongly denied the allegations of Chinese meddling in the 2020 presidential election here in the United States, saying that they were entirely fabricated. And I believe also the U.S. intelligence community has previously concluded that China did not interfere. I get that this is happening in the classic Donald Trump style. And so maybe it is more transparent, more overt. But haven't we seen, to some degree, previous U.S. administrations, whether they are Democrats or Republicans, try to get involved in other countries' elections in the past?
When I look back at this, I turned to the research done by a University of Hong Kong associate professor. His name is Dov Levin, and he has really looked into this. And Levin found that between January 1st, 1946 and December 31st, 2014, the U.S. government conducted 128 partisan electoral interventions, and 54 of those were in the Cold War era.
Oh, wow.
But he found stuff like, the secret funding of a political party or threatening a country, for instance, with the loss of money or some sort of economic policy change if a specific party wins or loses. There are ways for U.S. presidents to signal their preference without being overt and, falling into interference side of the spectrum. one of them, for instance, back in 2024, President Joe Biden and his aides were really frustrated with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And, they, they had to work with them, but they really were unhappy. And Netanyahu was really politically on the ropes back then. But the U.S. wasn't going to flat out say, hey, Israelis, please vote against Netanyahu. Still, there was this opposition leader at the time who was pretty popular then, Benny Gantz, and he visited Washington. He actually did so in defiance of Netanyahu's wishes. And the Biden administration went all out to welcome him. His meetings included one with Vice President Kamala Harris.
I recall.
Right? And so he didn't meet with President Biden, but still to meet with Harris, this opposite, and they were very public about it. It was a clear signal without being an overt endorsement. But for instance, if the United States is funneling funds to opposition parties, or is again like threatening, people by saying, "Look, you're gonna lose this amount of money if a particular party wins." These are the types of things that do count.
What about an endorsement, as you alluded to, we've seen with President Trump, for example, with the new Colombian leader? Is that considered election meddling?
So an endorsement would count as election interference. But what wouldn't count is like a general statement that is like, we really want this election to be conducted properly and fairly, right? What wouldn't count is just a photo op with a candidate or world leader, whatever. I mean, but no concrete result or no outright endorsement. So I will tell you that back in 2000, when the U.S. spent millions to fund the opposition running against Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia, you might remember Milosevic. He was the dictator type leader of Serbia and then Yugoslavia. He was in power for roughly 13 years, and he was one of the people who was part of the Balkans wars, and ultimately he was later put on trial for war crimes related to the 1990s Balkans conflict, but he died before a verdict. But that said, in this election, the U.S. absolutely did not want to see him win, and Milosevic was one of those leaders who did allow elections, but the opposition had been so fragmented, so they couldn't really defeat him. So the U.S. funded consultants helped convince the opposition to unite behind one candidate, Vojislav Kostunica. The funding was so fascinating. The U.S. even paid for cans of spray paint to write anti-Milosevic graffiti, right? And so they got really into this one. But it was because they saw Milosevic as like a war criminal that they did not want to see stay in power. And ultimately he was defeated.
And this at the time would have been the Democratic president, Bill Clinton, for much of that year in 2000.
Another really interesting case, to be honest, was El Salvador in 2004. I mean, we basically, it was this leftist party running against a right-wing guy, and it was the U.S. basically said to El Salvadorians, if this leftist candidate wins, we're going to cut off any aid you get, including they were threatening remittances.
Oh, wow.
And yeah. I mean, we were
and
really
remittances
blunt about
is
that.
what people often in the United States might send back to family members, relatives in El Salvador. Wow. And
so this was like, and the right-wing candidate won. He won for a variety of reasons, but it was very unusual to basically threaten a country's money.
Well, I want to go back in time a little bit. The historian you mentioned found that there were well over 100 cases of partisan electoral interventions. A number of those, I think you said 54, were in the post-Cold War era. So it seems like Republican or Democrat, this tradition of election interference has been a pretty common occurrence in the United States. Was it the case, though, that it was more covert? It wasn't as open as what we're seeing nowadays?
So the difference is a lot of what would have counted is stuff that was being done at lower levels. Like, say, an ambassador said something publicly. Or it was something where there was some funding directed to a particular group. And some of this, what was covert. I mean, this isn't just overt. What Dov Levin, the international relations scholar, told me was kind of unique about the Trump era is that so much of this interference is coming from the president himself. Like Trump himself is weighing in, as opposed to some underling who might make some comment.
And that is very unusual.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what really stood out to him.
So you're saying that this pattern has existed for some time. And I know you spend a lot of time speaking with diplomats here in Washington, D.C. I'm curious what they tell you about our history, the United States history of election interference or efforts to sway elections, and how they feel about this particular moment.
So, look, many U.S. diplomats, when they are being really frank, they will admit that, of course, the U.S. has preferences, and sometimes it has signaled them. Sometimes it has signaled them very overtly. Often it has done things covertly that we don't find out about 2 years later. But they are very wary of being too obvious about this and making this a standard part of U.S. policy. One of the main reasons for that is that if the party that you campaigned against wins, that's going to ruin your bilateral relationship, right? So U.S. diplomats feel as if the best thing generally is to stay neutral and, push for, clean elections, fair elections, democracy, that sort of thing, but not to take a partisan point of view, because ultimately you're going to have to deal with whatever party wins.
So it sounds like from the American diplomats you've spoken to, there is a nervousness about the United States interfering in other nations' elections, other sovereign countries, because it could potentially undermine U.S. foreign policy goals over the long run. What do you hear from diplomats from other countries?
They really feel as if America is hurting itself, damaging its alliances. And they keep saying, look, we get that this administration wants kind of a sugar high of the short win, but people have long memories, countries have long memories. And when you interfere, that over time will hurt you. And look, I think a classic example is Iran. Back in 1953, the CIA helped fuel a coup-like thing that basically brought the power back to the Shah instead of with the prime minister. When that got out, Iranians, I'm telling you, still to this day complain about that. And it was one of the reasons that the Iranian Revolution happened, because the people who wanted to overthrow the Shah could cast him as an American puppet. So if you're a US president and you're not thinking about second, third, fourth order effects, what is the long-term effect on our country in doing these types of endorsements, then you're taking a lot of risk.
Well, lots to think about. Nahal, thank you so much for spending some time and walking us through it all. I really appreciate it.
This is great. Thanks for having me.
That was Nahal Toosi, senior foreign affairs correspondent and columnist at Politico.
And earlier, we heard from the BBC Brazil correspondent in Brasilia, Leandro Prazeres.
And that's it for The Global Story on YouTube today. Thanks for spending some time with us. And if you enjoyed our show today, then I've got to mention that you can always find more from us here at The Global Story, because we are also an audio podcast. Just search for us on bbc.com or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.